Hello friends, this is your Krishna Mylvaganam, and today's video tutorial is about how to build an effective research model, how to propose effective research hypothesis, and how to develop an effective measurement instrument to measure the proposed hypothesis. Alright, so when I say research model, it is basically the most significant component of a research project. Why I'm saying is that if I want to look at someone's thesis, a research project, let's say if it is a 50,000 word research project or 100,000 word research project, if I could go into their research model and have a glance at their research model, I can pretty much get an understanding. I don't have to read through all 100 pages. I can get a very good understanding about what that particular research project is all about. So in my previous video that we looked at, what are the tips and steps that are available in order to gain entry to a quality university PhD program? That is where you need to convince the examiner, where you need to have an effective research problem, and you need to add on as much as research significance as much as possible, and also you need to you can add on research significance by exploring most of the knowledge gaps that are there on the chosen area of study. So these components will help you to obtain entry onto the program, but you need to have an effective research model developed in order for you to sustain onto the enrolled program. So that's the component that we're going to cover today. That being said, there are also certain limitations when we look at this research model, because to enhance the clarity of the viewers, what I've decided is that I'm going to keep the research model that we're going to look into as simple as possible. So when you take a research model, there are variables called independent variables, mediating variables, moderating variables, and dependent variables. But the model I'm going to look at, I'm going to eliminate the mediating and moderating variables, and I'm only going to look at independent variables and the dependent variable. Dependent variable is basically the chosen area of study. So dependent variable means it is basically the outcome or the output variable whose variation you are trying to look at. Independent variables are basically the input or the cost variables which are responsible for the variation that takes place in the dependent variable. Alright, so finally the chosen topic for today's video tutorial, since in the previous video I looked at innovation, I want to bring in some originality. So in this video per se, I have chosen the topic trust in an organizational context. So when I mean trust, I'm looking at what are the features, what are the variables that enables an organizational leader. What I mean as an organizational leader is the CEO. What are the variables within an organizational context that enables to build trust on the organizational leader? So I'm basically looking at the relationship between the leader and the followers, and what are the research variables that contribute for the leader to build trust among his employees. As you all know, trust is a burning issue in the 21st century. Let it be not necessarily within an organizational context, even within a family context or in any context, trust is declining, diminishing. So I see this is a critical area that organizations need to put their attention onto, but then again, this is a neglected area of study. So I'm looking at trust in an organizational context. And I also want to point out, when you look at change management theories in an organizational context, according to past research, about over 70% of research, the change initiatives are failing because of lack of employee trust among the organizations which are trying to implement these change initiatives. So despite of investing billions of dollars, if you can't win the employees' trust in the organization where you're trying to implement a change, it would not be a successful change initiative. So rather than me getting deviated with the subject of trust in an organizational context, now let's get on to the subject of this video. So I'm going to explain in 5 simple steps how you can develop your research model, how you can propose your research hypothesis, and how you can develop a research instrument to measure these research hypotheses. Step number 1, as I always say, you need to perform an extensive literature survey on your chosen area of study. In this case, it is basically trust in leadership. Now I've shortlisted the authors, critical authors who have contributed on this area of study, and I've shortlisted the research variables that they have explored on this particular area of study. So in this case, I have pointed out about 7 key authors who have contributed to this study and 6 research variables that they have explored. Research variable 1 is leadership ability, research variable 2 is leadership benevolence, research variable 3 is leadership integrity, research variable 4 is similar values and objectives, research variable 5 is the leader's trustfulness, And research variable 6 is leaders' respectfulness. Now, if you're performing a PhD research study, you cannot restrict yourself to 7 authors. You can probably shortlist about 30 to 50 authors who have contributed for your chosen area of study, and you look at what are the research variables that they have shortlisted. On an average, if you're looking at 30 to 50 authors, probably you would come up with about 20 research variables, they might have explored. Now, once you get that list, the second important step, you need to shortlist the research variables that would be relevant for your chosen area of research context. Now, in this case, let's say your research context is an organization located in Sri Lanka. So for that particular chosen area of context, you need to find out which could be the most relevant research variables that you could study. Now, there are 2 tips which you can employ in order to identify the most relevant research variables for your research context. One, you look at what are the most frequently used research variables by the most prominent authors who have contributed for this area of study. Tip number 2, then you can also perform a pilot study. A pilot study is basically a trial version of your major research. Let's look at if your major research involves about 100 research respondents. You can probably take about 10% of it, 10 research respondents, and perform a small study and see out of these let's say there's about 20 research variables. You can see out of these 20 research variables, which are the most prominent variables that they feel would build trust in their leaders. So these 2 tips you can employ in order to shortlist if you have a wide number of research variables. To shortlist the number of variables, you can apply these 2 tips. Once you shortlist the research variables, then you develop as step number 2 your conceptual model. So as I said earlier, I'm limiting the scope of the conceptual model, hence we are only looking at independent variables and dependent variables. So as you can clearly see, there were 6 research variables that were studied by 7 different authors, but from that 6 research variables, I have chosen only 3 research variables as the scope on my research model. So this is basically called as the conceptual model. So in my conceptual model, I have shortlisted the first 3 research variables, which are basically the leader's ability, the leader's benevolence, the leader's integrity. Once you shortlist the research variables, it doesn't stop there. Then, as step number 3, you need to shortlist the indicators that define these research variables. For example, though out of 7 authors, 5 authors have proposed leadership ability as a significant research variable for the study of trust in leadership, their conceptualization or their definition of ability might differ from author to author. For example, if you look at the research variable ability, Butler's conceptualization of the research variable ability is based on the indicator competence, whereas Whitener et al.'s conceptualization of the research variable ability is based on indicators such as communication, sharing and delegation, perceived competence. And then if you look at Burke et al.'s conceptualization of the research variable ability is based on indicators such as setting compelling direction and creation of enabling structure. Similarly, Coleman defines ability based on the indicator professionalism, and I have built these tables by combining international researchers and local researchers. So I have included few Sri Lankan authors as well. There is a Sri Lankan author called Sena Ratna and Sivasegaram, where they have conceptualized the research variable ability based on indicators such as strategic capabilities, communication, and emotional intelligence. So similar to the first research variable, if you could see even for the second research variable, benevolence, there are variations between different authors' conceptualization, meaning the type of indicators that they have used to conceptualize the variable is different. It is very much the same case when you look at the third research variable as well, the conceptualization of integrity. There seems to be a certain amount of variation between the author's conceptualization of that particular research variable. So once you locate different authors, different indicators, then again, similar to the second step, you need to shortlist these indicators as well. How you can do that? You apply the same 2 tips that I have shared. You look at the indicators that has been quite often used by the significant studies in the past, and also you can shortlist based on your pilot interview. You look at pilot study, you look at what are the significant indicators that are relevant for your research context, and you can shortlist them. And as step number 3, once you shortlist the indicators, you build your analytical framework. Analytical model is very similar to conceptual model. It's a bit detailed, where on top of stating your research variables, you also need to highlight your indicators that are being used to define your research variables. Now, in this case, I have chosen to define the research variable ability. I have chosen this Sri Lankan author named Senaratna and Sivasegaram, where he has refined leadership ability based on indicators such as strategic capabilities, communication, and emotional intelligence. Since he is a Sri Lankan author, I see it is to be more relevant to define leadership ability in a Sri Lankan research context. Hence, I have chosen his indicators to define my first research variable. If you look at to define my second research variable, I have utilized a combination of two authors. I have utilized the indicators that were used by Butler. There were 4 indicators such as loyalty, openness, receptivity, and availability. And the other author's indicators seems to be very similar to the 4 indicators that were proposed by Butler. Hence, I have neglected them. But then again, Senaratna and Sivasegaram's indicator, which is empathy, seems to be a little different from the 4 indicators that are proposed by Butler. Hence, I've included to define my second research variable. So my second research variable indicators are a mix of Butler's indicators and Senaratna and Sivasegaram's indicator. Similarly, for the third research variable, I have again utilized Butler's indicators. However, I have eliminated one of his indicator called discreteness, because discreteness looks quite similar to the promise fulfillment indicator. Hence, I have replaced that with another Sri Lankan author's indicator, which is honesty. It is coming from Kasturi Arachi, who is a Sri Lankan author. So I've replaced discreteness by honesty. So to define my third research variable as well, I have utilized a combination of 2 authors' indicators, and I have developed my analytical model. Now, the originality I'm bringing into this area of study is basically the unique combination of these indicators, the unique combination of these multiple authors' indicators, which I'm bringing into my analytical model, and I'm developing a new analytical model, which is entirely new, because this unique combination has not been proposed by any other researchers. So this is the originality of my model, because this unique combination has not been there in the previous research studies. So in that way, you are making a significant contribution for this particular area of study. So step number 4, once you develop your analytical model, your detailed analytical model, then for each of the indicators, you can propose a hypothesis. As you can see, for each of the 12 indicators, I have proposed research hypothesis. But in this case, if you look at the hypothesis in detail, you would notice that there is a strength and direction stated in each of these hypotheses. I would like to point out this here, because wherever you notice a research hypothesis, if it contains strength and direction, that means that particular research hypothesis can only be measured quantitatively. So that particular research study has to be performed based on a quantitative research study. Now, let's look at the first research hypothesis. It says that there is a strong positive relationship between the leader's strategic capabilities and the trust in organizational leadership. So what I mean as strength and direction is this. So there is a strong, that means there is a, that's what they mean as strength. And there is a positive relationship, which is basically the direction. So wherever you find a hypothesis which says there is a strong positive relationship, or wherever you see a hypothesis which says there is a strong negative relationship, then they have included the strength and direction features, which makes it a quantitative study. The same hypothesis can be measured qualitatively if the hypothesis states that there is a relationship between the leader's strategic capabilities and trust in organizational leadership. In such hypothesis, there is no strength or direction has been proposed. So always remember, depending on your research hypothesis, your research design will vary. So if your research hypothesis contains strength and direction, that means it has to be performed as a quantitative study. If your hypothesis does not contain these features, then it can be performed as a qualitative study. But there are various research projects which has hypothesis which can be measured quantitatively, as well as hypothesis which can be measured qualitatively. Such projects design would be a mixed method research design. Okay, so once you list down your research hypothesis, then it's a matter of analyzing the hypothesis and identifying the findings. So your purpose of your study is basically to measure these hypotheses. One other thing I would like to point out is that if your research questions are not very broad, you don't necessarily have to write your research questions. Your hypotheses are good enough for you to proceed with your study. Alright, so once you propose your hypothesis, how do you measure the hypothesis is that you need to have a measurement instrument. You need to have a data collection instrument, which is basically a survey questionnaire. So how do you build your survey questionnaire? Step number 5 is that you go back to the authors from whom you have selected the indicators from, and you locate their research projects or research articles, and you locate their annexures or appendices where they would have put they would have stated their research instruments. They would have put it as an annexure or appendix their survey questionnaires. From those survey questionnaires, you can extract the questions that they have used to identify the relationship between their indicators and the dependent variables. For example, let's say now my analytical model, my indicators of my analytical model are based on 4 different authors' indicators. So if I could locate these 4 different authors' survey questionnaires, and if I can locate the questions that they have used to measure the relationship between these indicators and the dependent variable, I can very well extract them and I can build up my own research instrument. And the originality I'm bringing to my own research instrument is again the unique combination of these different authors' survey questions. So I'm going to take up these 4 different author survey questions, and I'm going to extract the components which will give me the questions to analyze the relevant authors, indicators and the dependent variable, and I'm going to build up my own research instrument. Alright guys, in summary, let's relook at the 5 steps that we just looked at. Step number 1, please perform an extensive literature survey on your chosen area of study. Identify the significant authors who have contributed for that chosen area of study, and identify the research variables that these authors have explored in their research study, and make a comprehensive list. Once you make that list, then you need to shortlist from that list the research variables that you're going to include in your conceptual model. How do you do that? We have looked at 2 tips for that. One, you identify the most repetitive research variables that have been used in the past research study, and you can shortlist them. If not, you perform a pilot study in your research context and you identify what are the research variables from this list is relevant for your particular research context, and you build your conceptual model. Once you develop that, it doesn't stop there. You need to then develop your analytical model, for which you need to again apply the same practice. You need to shortlist the indicators from the past research studies, and you build up your analytical model. Once you develop your analytical model, for each of these indicators, you develop hypotheses. In my case, for each of the 12 indicators, I have developed 12 hypotheses. Once you develop your hypothesis, the final step, the 5th step, is where you develop your research instrument, which is again very simple. You go back to the authors from whom you have collected your indicators, and you locate their annexures, and you locate their survey questionnaires, and you locate the questions that they have used to identify the relationship between these indicators and the dependent variables, and you collect it from each of these authors and you build up your own research instrument. So once you perform these 5 steps, it assures that you have a very good research model, and you have relevant hypotheses with relevant research variables, and you have a very good research instrument to measure these hypotheses. Finally, I want to point out that if you could look at my previous video and this video, in combination of these 2 videos, I have covered all the significant topics that need to be covered for PhD students to complete their first chapter successfully. So first chapter is pretty much the most important chapter, because it is the most time consuming chapter, because by the time you complete your first chapter, you have pretty much set the scene and you know what precisely you're going to do. This is your problem, these are your research hypotheses, so you very well know the purpose of your research project. So the other chapters are not as time consuming as your first chapter. So my future videos, probably I will do one video about how to do an effective literature critic for chapter 2, and the following video could be on the research design, chapter 3, and then the final video could be on data analysis if time permits. If there is a way, I will show how you can utilize the SPSS software to analyze the collected data and all that, and then the conclusion chapter. So hope these videos are useful. As always, let's spread love and question, you know what it is. And thank you very much for listening to this video. So till we meet again, all the very best in your future endeavors. Love you all. Thank you. Godspeed.